Today is April 3rd. Ukraine Media Center of Green Forum starts its operation today. My name is Vasil Samoklalo and we're starting our briefing today with our guest Oleksandr Merezhko, head of the Parliamentary Committee on Foreign Policy and Interparliamentary Cooperation. Good afternoon, Mr. Oleksandr. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Mr. Oleksandr, first question. Russia's presidency in the Security Council of the United Nations. The last time it was happening, it was during the period when they started the full-scale invasion. What this presidency means for Ukraine, how is it a threat, and how should we cope with it? First of all, this presidency is contemplated by special rules, by the regulations of the Security Council of the United Nations. We use the principle of rotation here, so every member of the Security Council within a month has a presidency in the most important body of the United Nations, the Security Council. The main competency, the main function of the country presiding in the Security Council, during the meetings of the Security Council, they should keep track of the compliance of with the procedures. I would say this role is not as much political as more legal and technical. So if we talk about the Russia's presidency during this period, I'm seeing the problem and the threat of a political and symbolic nature here, because it looks like absurd. Again, Russia has no legal grounds for being a member of the United Nations organization. It usurped the place that belonged to the Soviet Union, and if we read the statute of the United Nations, Russia is not mentioned here. It only tells about the permanent members of the Security Council, which includes Soviet Union, so Russia again has no legal grounds to be a part of the United Nations. Meanwhile, they are still on the Security Council. And secondly, one of the tasks of the Security Council is fighting the crime of aggression, prevention of aggression and fighting it. So it's a paradoxical and absurd situation when the aggressor state acts as a presiding country during the meetings of the Security Council, which considers the matters of countering aggression. And thirdly, Russia was already recognized a terroristic regime by a number of resolutions. And again, we face the absurd situation when we see that the terroristic regime has no right to be a part of the organization, of the United Nations organization, let alone preside in the Security Council. And yet another thing, Russia continues to commit this crime of aggression. Recently, the International Criminal Court issued the arrest warrant in the name of Vladimir Putin, the head of this terroristic state. This is the paradox, and we have something to do about it. For example, recently I've heard the call to boycott the meetings of the Security Council. It's a symbolic step which has its meaning nevertheless. What should we expect the United Nations to do? Will it transform? Will it get rid of Russia? What's the role and what's the future of this organization on the modern map of the world diplomacy? I can only express my own opinion here. I think that for the time being, the United Nations organization, well, its destiny reminds me of League of Nations, because United Nations didn't meet its obligations in terms of protecting members of its its members, I mean Ukraine, protecting it against the aggression. It requires radical reform, or it will be forgotten, just in a way that the League of Nations was. The reformation of the United Nations organization, specifically the Security Council, is way overdue. For the time being, the permanent members of the Security Council, they don't mirror the real situation in the world. For example, there is no single African country on the board. There is no single Latin American country, or for example India there, which will shortly become one of the world powers. Well, it says that even the number of permanent and the composition of permanent members of the Security Council should be changed. They do not fulfill their basic function. It's paralyzed because the aggressor state is on that council, which blocks the resolution of the disputes and conflicts in the world. Before we pass on to the floor, to the questions on the floor, another question. So what's the situation inside the United Nations itself? For example, some influential countries that are on the Security Council, what's their attitude to such reformation? For example, the United States, the France, what's their attitude? Is it only the Ukrainian view of the problem? No, it's not only the Ukrainian view of the problem. There was a number of attempts to reform the United Nations. I want to remind you, there was a period when Ukraine was presiding the Security Council of the United Nations, and Gennady Udovenko was representing Ukraine back then, and the necessity of the reformation was already discussed there with a number of plans for such reformations. Well, it was happening during the presidency of different Secretaries General of the United Nations, but there was no sufficient political will for such reformation. We understand that different countries, for example, the countries which are the permanent members of the Security Councils of the United Nations, they have different attitudes to the necessity of reformation. There are countries that want to preserve their right of veto, because the status of the permanent member of the Security Council and the right of veto is very important for some countries. So some countries are not quite interested in such reformation, but there are other influential members that may favor such reformation. For example, I remember that back in 1991, when there was first question brought up about who will take the place of the Soviet Union in place of Soviet Union. So there was interest from such countries as Japan and Germany, and if we recall the history of diplomacy, they were part of the League of Nations, so there are countries who are interested in such reformation. So it's important to create the coalition of such countries which are interested in real reforms of the Security Council and the United Nations organization itself. But there are some legal matters around it. According to the Statute of the United Nations, any amendments, we understand that no reformation can be made without amendment of the statute. So any amendments to the statute, they require the consent of the permanent members of the Security Council of the United Nations. So we may end up in a dead end here. So we have to find a legal mechanism which would allow us to reform the United Nations organization, or even ponder about creating of a new organization to support international stability and peace. Thank you. Dear journalists, your questions, please. Angelina Strashko, Ukrinform. Mr. Oleksandr, there was a report that the delegation, the parliamentary delegation, was about to visit the United States of America. Are you going to be a part of this delegation, and what will be its task? Well, the work is underway on this matter. I'm just back from Washington, D.C. I brought up this issue in communication with my colleagues, congressmen and senators. I think that this issue will be resolved this year, and such visit of the head of the parliament, it will happen. It's not yet sorted out. First of all, we have to organize the visit in principle, but we know that recently the picture changed in the Chamber of Representatives in the Congress of the United Nations. Now the Republicans prevail there, and the new speaker is McCarthy. It requires certain time. I believe even from the point of view of parliamentary diplomacy to organize a visit like that. I'm having a question from myself. It was reported recently that President Zelensky is about to visit Poland. What should we expect from this visit? Well, it's a very important visit, very important official visit. A very important visit to a friendly country, to a partnering country. It's important for development of our relations with Poland. We see how actively Poland is helping Ukraine. Even today there was news about the military airplanes, the handing over of military airplanes. We see that Poland does everything that they can to support Ukraine in all senses, to support it holistically, diplomatically, economically, to provide military support. I think that a visit like this will be filled with relevant agreements to be entered into between our countries, and this visit, it will emphasize the specific status of strategic partnership between our countries. Okay, so the last question. There was information about the elections in Finland, which were won by opposition. We understand that large number of countries is entering the elections process. The governments are about to change in many countries. So under conditions like this, how should we preserve this anti-Russian coalition, anti-Russian unity? I'm convinced that the policy of Finland will not be changed. It will continue the course to support Ukraine. We are interested that after the fact that Finland, in fact, has already become a part of NATO, a member of NATO, we need this country as a member of this important organization to support the Ukrainian membership in NATO. But as to the elections, it's a normal thing for any democratic country. I'm convinced that regardless any internal political processes, Finland will continue to actively support Ukraine further on. Thank you very much. Joining us was Oleksandr Merezhko, the head of Parliamentary Committee on Foreign Policy and Interparliamentary Cooperation, and at 1400 we will talk to Ivan Fedorov, mayor of Melitopol. We will talk about today's morning explosions, and not only about that. See you shortly.